names. We've got Steve Rush, who served as the chairman of our truck leasing task force. We've got Dr. Steve Maselli, who was also a member of our truck leasing task force, and Todd Spencer, president of the Owner Operator Independent Drivers Association. And first of all, as background, the truck leasing task force was something that Congress mandated because there was concern that there were things going on in the industry involving truck leases, in particular the lease purchase agreements that some of the drivers were being signed up under. And Congress passed legislation directing that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration set up a truck leasing task force, and they would operate under the Federal Advisory Committee Act rules, which meant that all their meetings would be public. The public could attend those meetings, and there would be a public comment session during each of those meetings. All the notes, discussion notes, and everything would be made publicly available at our website. And then finally, that advisory committee would issue its report to Congress. So this was all set up with the direction of Congress, and the agency was more than happy to engage the industry and put together a distinguished panel of members to serve on that truck leasing task force. And just to give you a little more details on how the truck leasing task force operated, we had a series of 7 virtual meetings that allowed the members to get together more frequently and conduct their deliberations. And in each of those virtual meetings, there was an opportunity for the public to watch and to participate during the public comment session. And we also had the benefit, because of the timing, that we had an in-person session at the Mid-America Truck Show in 2024, where you had lots of attendees that met could actually come and listen to the deliberations of the truck leasing task force, and some of the drivers could share their own personal experiences with these lease purchase agreements. And we had the opportunity to put out a federal register notice where we invited all interested parties to send us their thoughts and their perspectives on these purchase agreements, and to have drivers send us their real-world examples of some predatory leasing agreements they had been signed up to. And we had a lot of help from our friends at the Consumer Financial Protection Board, because they've got expertise in these matters. So we had them participate and help support the work of our truck leasing task force, provide the legal analogies to support the work of the truck leasing task force. And as the TLTF did their work, they came up with working definitions to make sure that everyone was on the same page as to what the terms meant and what we were talking about as they had their deliberations and made their findings and produced their recommendations. So they came up with their definition of lease operator. We've got their definition of a lease purchase agreement or contract, and their definition of a lease purchase program. I think one of the big things that came out of those deliberations was making it clear, if a driver signs a contract that's got that term lease in it, and that driver is not going to have any equity in the asset is the truck. So yes, you're signing an agreement, but as part of that agreement, you are not going to have any equity in that asset. You're not going to have ownership in it. At the end of the lease period, you may have the opportunity to purchase it, and as long as you got the lease in there, the lease in itself doesn't put you on a track to obtain ownership. So having their important working definitions, so that as they continue their work with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, there was a clear understanding of what we were looking at and what we needed to dig deeper into, find out what exactly is going on to resolve these predatory arrangements. And to just take a high-level glance at the TLTF's consensus findings, that there are arrangements whereby a motor carrier controls the work compensation. That is a bad situation for the driver, because you're leasing the driver a vehicle, and because you're controlling the driver's compensation, you've got the upper hand that this driver is never going to make enough money to successfully close out that lease. And if that lease does end, the driver's going to end up in debt owing you money. And that some of these lease arrangements, they're set up so that it's definitely set up to benefit the motor carrier financially. And we've heard some horror stories where a driver would sign a lease agreement, unsuccessfully walk away from the lease, owing the carrier money. The carrier would take the same exact vehicle, turn around and lease it to someone else, get another person on financially for that same vehicle. So watching out for these arrangements where the driver is leasing the vehicle from the motor carrier. Motor carrier then controls your ability to earn money, and you could end up in very bad situations that way. and that there's the perspective of the TLTF, that these programs promote a race to the bottom and take a good pathway, something that had been a good pathway to a middle class living and making it a race to the bottom so that you just end up ruining some drivers financially. And that yes, there is a possibility of litigation for the driver to help salvage the situation, but in the meantime, you have no income, you don't have access to the truck. So litigation doesn't exactly provide a practical solution for a lot of these drivers that get pulled into a predatory leasing arrangement. So those are the consensus findings from the TLTF, just a high level recap. And then the recommendations from the TLTF basically fell to about 7 categories, as you can see here, where there was the belief that they needed, or that they thought that Congress should step in and that there should be legislation that would essentially prohibit these predatory lease purchase arrangements, and that Congress should also, if they don't take action to just come out with legislation to prohibit it, that there should be some additional federal oversight, bringing in statutory for FMCSA, the Department of Labor, the Federal Trade Commission, Consumer Financial Protection Board, bringing all these entities together to provide some effective oversight of these lease purchase arrangements. And then looking specifically to FMCSA, there are recommendations for additional oversight from the agency, if indeed we had the authority to do so, and also pushing for mandatory disclosures of the conditions and prohibitions and certain conditions or terms within those leases, and ask for the Veterans Affairs, Department of Labor, and other institutions that provide grants for training to get them more heavily involved to make sure that we do things to help protect these drivers from predatory leasing arrangements, and also a role for state and local enforcement agencies in this predatory leasing environment. So you have 7 basic categories for the recommendations from the Truck Leasing Task Force. And they did issue their final report in January. And we've got the URLs there so that you can see the Truck Leasing Task Force final report, including their findings and recommendations. And one other document that wasn't as widely publicized, the final report from the Consumer Financial Protection Board. They did the in-depth legal analysis of some of these real-world examples of predatory leasing arrangements, the comprehensive report to accompany the final report from the Truck Leasing Task Force. And with that brief background on the work of the Truck Leasing Task Force and how they did their work, I can introduce my panelists and give you a little bit more background. We've got Dr. Steve Zelli, and he's an economic sociologist who studies work and labor markets and goods movement. He is a professor of practice at the University of Pennsylvania and a faculty fellow at the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. In 2016, he published The Big Rig, Trucking and Decline of the American Dream, which explains how deregulation of trucking and the rise of independent contracting turned trucking from one of the best blue-collar jobs in the U.S. into one of the toughest. Since that time, he has worked on a wide range of research policy initiatives at the state and federal levels to improve training, pay, and working conditions for truck drivers. And his recent research is focused on self-driving trucks, the truck driver labor market, and how training and compensation affect safety. In 2023 and 2024, and he served as a member of our DOT Truck Leasing Task Force, and he currently serves as an advisor to the Truck Safety Coalition. So that's Steve on the end here. We have Steve Rush, is the co-founder, or the founder, I should say, Carbon Express Incorporated. And prior to entering the trucking world, Steve worked as a radio operator for the Air Force, where he directed traffic between the aircraft and air traffic control. In his early trucking career, he hauled U.S. mail, refrigerated LTL, and eventually tank trucks. In 1969, he became an owner-operator and went on to found Carbon Express in 1983. And Steve is a current member of the American Trucking Association Board and is a past chairman of the National Tank Truck Association. So in 2023 and 2024, Steve served as the chairperson of our Truck Leasing Task Force. And finally, the last gentleman needs very little introduction at all. And that's Todd Spencer, President and CEO of the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. His career began in 1974 as an employee driver, and And 2 years later, when he purchased a truck, he became an owner-operator, leased to a motor carrier. And in 1978, he was elected to the association's board of directors. By 1981, he sold his 2 trucks and joined OIDA, communications director and editor of their magazine, Landline. Todd was elected executive vice president in 1992 and held the position for 26 years until he was elected president in 2018. He has testified before various committees in the U.S. Congress on trucking issues and served on various committees of the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance as an industry representative. Additionally, he serves as an industry advisor to the National Transportation Safety Board and FMCSA's Motor Carrier Safety Advisory Committee, where he was a member from 2007 to 2024. So that's my distinguished panel. They'll be up here this afternoon working with me. And with that introduction, I'd like to give each of the panelists a chance to offer their thoughts and perspectives on truck leasing, starting with Dr. Purcell.
Thanks, Larry. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm an economic sociologist. I've been given the task of going over some of our findings from the process of the task force. But I wanted to begin by talking about how I initially became interested in this issue of lease purchase a little more than 20 years ago. I was doing research on the decline in truck driver wages after deregulation. Became interested in what had happened in that labor market. Most of you, I'm sure, are aware of the story of declining wages and working conditions in truck driving after deregulation. I went out, I got a job as a driver, working long haul for 6 months as part of my initial research into the industry. And then I started interviewing truck drivers at truck stops throughout the Midwest. And one of those first interviews that I did in 2005 still sticks with me to this day. I was aware at that point, having spent 6 months in the industry, that there was, there were owner operators, of course, and that there were drivers who were working for companies just like mine, doing essentially the same work, who identified themselves as owner operators and were involved in leasing the truck from their companies. But I didn't really understand what that relationship looked like or what the importance of it was. And then one night, while I was doing interviews and going through the truck stop, sampling drivers and spending 45 minutes to an hour with them, I met a driver who had a lot on his mind, and I could tell he was a little bit upset when I first met him. He had a lot going on. He was standing by the phone. And I said, "Do you have some time to tell me about your job, career, and doing this research project?" He immediately turned the tables on me. He said, "Well, why do you want to know? What are you going to do with this? Why should I care?" So I gave him my spiel. We sat down, and he proceeded to tell me he was in a new relationship in this lease purchase with a major carrier. He had just left another carrier where he worked as an employee and had been sent into Hurricane Katrina, essentially. A load, dispatching him through the path of the storm. He tried to refuse the load. The employer said, "Well, you either take the load or find a new job." So he got stuck in the storm and decided at that point that he was going to never let that happen again. He was going to get control over his work, and was convinced to enter a lease purchase. When I met him that night, he was waiting by the phone to hear from his dispatcher, because he had just received a paycheck from the previous week for something on the order of like $64 or something like that. And the week before that, I think he had a negative paycheck or another one for less than $100. And he was, calling up to complain and try to see what could be done about it. And he was, explaining all this to me, and he said, "Do you really understand what this is like?" And I said, "I don't." He said, "Well, let me explain to you what this has done. I've been on the road for weeks." He said, "I've actually taken to lying to my daughter, my young daughter, because her mom can't get her to go to sleep at night because I'm not home, and she's worried that something's wrong and we're not telling her the truth. So every night I have to call my daughter and tell her don't worry, honey, I'm going to be home when you wake up in the morning. He said, and that's how we get her to sleep every night. And that's because I can't pay the bills at home because I'm paying the expenses on my truck and I'm not getting enough miles to make this work. And so that conversation still 20 years later sticks in my mind. And unfortunately, I've heard those stories, over and over and over again. And we did in the truck leasing task force as well. So I want you all to never lose, account of the fact that what we're talking about with these results, and you could see them in the links here, there are hundreds of thousands of drivers. And that gives us, I think, everyone who's on the task force, a weight of responsibility that we all take very seriously when we get this, because we do know that these are the stories of real workers who are out there just trying to. Slides up there. Okay. No, you don't have my slides?
Nope.
Okay. All right. So let me, I'll go through the findings, the primary finding. Well, let me first tell you what we looked at. So we had our meetings, the public meetings. We gathered public comments. We were able to, through our petition for or request for leases, to gather examples of leases. We gathered some carrier data on what was happening, and we also were able to, in searching for more data on the number of drivers and the economic impacts on them, we went to public court records to try to find data that had been produced in cases, particularly those who are those that involved minimum wage violations and others in class action lawsuits in which there was a significant amount of public data. So there were really a couple of important features that we found across these different lease purchases. Of course, the drivers do not get equity in the truck. That's required by the leasing. They're treated as independent contractors, so they're not entitled to workers' compensation, employment insurance, various labor protections, etc. But what we found was that in most cases, they were prohibited from working for other carriers. They worked just as employees would work in most cases. And the reason that drivers end up in these, and I should say, we did see some variation in the contracts. They could range from just a couple pages of details that missed a lot of the important stuff drivers would deal with, all the way to dense legalese boilerplate, and that ran to many pages with. In which the commonality across these two sets of contracts was that drivers were never negotiating anything. These are all take it or leave it kinds of contracts. The big difference between these lease purchase drivers and those employee drivers comes out data, and they're responsible for the payments for the truck itself, the insurance, the fuel, sometimes registration, and potentially a variety of other charges, which can add to thousands of dollars per week in revenue that they have to generate before they earn a take home. That's that first story that I experienced. So they can typically vary from 3 to 5 years. And now, why do drivers do this? In some segments, that's all there is available. So if you go down to the ports, particularly for some of these immigrant drivers who are not familiar with the labor market due to the industry, they may be told by an employer or would-be employer, "We don't have any company trucks. If you want to work for us, you got to at least purchase the truck from us." Sometimes other drivers want to get out of a training contract. There are carriers who will offer lease purchase 2 drivers who are coming out of their CDL school, and they tell them, look, you owe us $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 for this training, which you can pay back by working for us over the next year, or we'll forgive that if you lease purchase a truck. In general, the drivers who are not in those 2 categories, some of them who are, they want more control, more money out of lease purchase. That's what they're looking for, and some indeed do want to end up owning a truck at the end. Again, there's no way to build equity. This is by virtue of tax law. They're depreciating at the rate that you're using. So, what the drivers get from the carriers oftentimes is a misleading portrait of what they're going to get out of this relationship towards those goals. And we have some data in there that came out of these cases. Some of these pitches can be quite sophisticated. There are carriers who have a third party that acts as a business consultant that will provide drivers with profit and loss statements with inflated amounts of potential revenue, et cetera, that convince them that this is, they will reach their goals doing this. But for the most part, what drivers think is, if I'm independent, if I own the truck, I'm going to be able to pick my loads, run more miles, bring more money home, and also be home. So what they actually experience from what we found is, little to no control over it. Of course, there's no equity in being built in the truck, and the cut and pay is substantial. This is because the drivers have to generate thousands of dollars a week in revenue just to cover those basic expenses. And what that results in is potentially, particularly in some of the smaller firms, some of the worst programs, a reduced ability to maintain that truck properly, but lots more pressure to drive when you might not otherwise drive because of conditions, when you're fatigued, and more time out on the road just trying to pay those bills, because those couple days at home can result in a short week, which I'll explain. But overall, less pay, much more stress and fatigue for the drivers. The reality of pay was quite a bit worse than we anticipated. We were able to gather data again from the public court documents. In one case where we had analysis, the drivers at that firm were making about 27 cents a mile for total compensation compared to what was estimated about 70 cents when all benefits were included for employees. So these drivers were working, and these were highly productive drivers in this case. Were earning, roughly a third of what employees were earning on average. The occurrence of 0 or negative paychecks was extremely common, up to a third of all weeks in some of the data that we found. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but this results in drivers regularly earning less than minimum wage because they're not taking anything home for a particular week, but since they're classified as contractors, of course, they're not entitled to minimum wage. And oftentimes and regularly, carriers would withhold driver pay in maintenance and performance escrow accounts that were often zeroed out when the driver left the contract. The company would simply continue to deduct the expenses for a few weeks until whatever they had built up in escrow. We typically saw around $2,500 would be an escrow for maintenance, but we saw as high as $10,000 in driver pay that be taken by the company for a series of deducted expenses. Just to give you a sense of what this sounds like from the company perspective in one of these suits, this is a driver manager in one of these class action lawsuits that was talking about the prevalence of negative checks. Paydays were some of our most stressful days. It was common in office culture to dread Tuesdays and Thursdays because most driver managers would be assuming that they would be having difficult conversations with their drivers regarding negative paychecks. And the plaintiff's attorney asks, so what do you mean by a negative paycheck? As in they owe the company money. Anywhere up to possibly even half of my fleet could have gone negative on any given payday. I remember it was significant enough that on one particular pay period, I sent an email to both my boss and his boss celebrating the fact that not a single one of my drivers had gotten anything less than a positive paycheck. That statement was significant enough that my boss's boss went in, dug through the system, and looked at every single one of my drivers because he was expecting to see someone that had not gotten a positive paycheck. And then he came and spoke to me. You're right, every single one of your drivers got a positive paycheck this week. Good job. Now, for most of us, I think, maybe before this presentation, positive paycheck would have been redundant for you. But it's not for these drivers. And it's not just, something that can happen. It's something that happens routinely to these drivers. And you can just imagine the pressure that this puts on them if they've got a load that, maybe they don't think they can complete safely, or they're tired, or they're bad weather conditions, the additional pressure they're going to feel to move that load to make sure that that load gets, on that next paycheck so they can pay this. And we heard a lot about it. What's the rate of success? So when we came into this, I think we had a wide range of opinions coming in and experience. We had a number of members, including the chairman, who had seen, or who were concerned about the pathway to small business ownership and whether or not these we could find better models for how carriers could help drivers get into trucks. And so we really began with a wide range of opinions on whether or not we could, find better examples and build some recommendations around how to do this right. And so we set out looking for those good programs, and with the idea that we could model some recommendations around that. Unfortunately, we simply did not find the company data that we did get. This was the most positive that we found. One company sent us numbers on their buyouts. And they were averaging a fleet of about 1,500 trucks through most of the years that they sent us the buyouts from. And they averaged about 34 buyouts per year out of a fleet of about 1,500. And so success in this, meant that, the drivers were going to be working for lower wages than they would have, as an employee. And then we end up purchasing the truck for essentially the market value with a balloon payment at the end, right? And so when we looked at the turnover rates and the size of the fleets, et cetera, even at these better programs that had, buyouts to actually talk about, it looked closer to 1 in 100 drivers that were successful at ending up with a truck at the end of these. That turned out to be probably a little bit higher. And this is another case against Celadon. So maybe like they did not run out of business, but these companies were clearly aware of these success rates or lack thereof. This is their vice president of operations in one of the cases that we had documents into the record, being asked about how many drivers, what percentage of drivers complete the lease purchase. He says 5 to 10%. And then was asked why the rate's so low, and he said personal financial management, which is a lot of what we heard, from those who said, you can make it, but it's up to you. And what we really found was that these were structured to produce these rates, and they were well aware of them. How many of those 90 to 95% who failed the program ended up in debt to Celadon? He says about 50%. So we're left with, room credit debt to. Now it turned out in that same set of documents that ended up in the record, there were management reports from Celadon that suggested that in fact it was far less than 5 to 10%, that they were experiencing 245 to 328% annualized turnover in this program, which suggested that in 2016 they had about 3,000 drivers cycle through that program, and about 1 in 1,000 of those drivers were actually completing it successfully. Now this gets to one of our main questions. We have an report appendix in which we detail the available court cases that we could see in the public record. Many of them are not, because a lot of these drivers, of course, most of them don't challenge it at all, of course. And we could count up just in the cases that were in the public record over 100,000 drivers. So it's likely that the estimates we have in the report, we've got over 100,000 drivers impacted these programs. On the plus side, initially this slide was blank, but I put path to small business ownership because I want to be clear about this. We really wrestled with this issue because we thought, you know, we're going to weigh we know there are bad programs out there. Everybody can do that going into this. We thought, you know, what we're going to end up doing is balancing the trade-off of protecting those drivers who are getting hurt by these programs by with the drivers who are benefiting from getting an opportunity to take that first step toward owning their own truck, small business ownership. We really did not see any evidence. We didn't have a single driver that came through that said, hey, this is how I got my start. If it hadn't been for this lease purchase program, I wouldn't own my truck today. I wouldn't be a small business trucker today. We didn't hear a single example of that. Now, we did have drivers who, you know, who went on to own their own truck or start their own business. And what they said was, that was the worst mistake I ever made. That set me back years, you know, because you got no equity in that truck. You're making less than you would have otherwise, and you're not developing small business skills. Todd, Steve can speak to this better. Again, I want to bring it back to the workers. You know, we have debates about you know, this workforce and how many people want to do this job, how we keep people in this job and make it a good, safe job. You know, these are hard-working folks that we heard from over and over again, just trying to make a living, provide for their families. And these programs are taking a serious toll on them and the workforce overall. These are often inexperienced workers and they're increasingly vulnerable. So, you know, we see some of these programs targeting, for instance, you know, younger workers coming out of training programs. As the data suggests, the number one origin for new truck drivers is unemployment. So a lot of folks are coming into this with, you know, bad credit history, you know, low credit scores, maybe out of unemployment, maybe, you know, homeless or near homeless, and they're being you know, taken advantage of by these programs. This is before we get to the, you know, current issues that we've been discussing quite a bit around immigrant drivers, who are some of the most highly, you know, targeted by these programs, particularly in places like ports, where these sorts of programs are the norm. So, you know, this is really about those careers that were ended, detoured by them. But the consequences for these individuals, we heard about, you know, you lose the house, you know, you lose your credit, you know, worthiness, and right from that to divorce. So some real hard stories that we heard. Drivers have few remedies. The vast majority of this has been going on for 20 years that I know about personally, hearing these stories. With little change and no real attention to the issue at all. And the drivers have few remedies. It's just, you know, they move on. What can they do? Take on a big Goliath company or some little company that doesn't have, you know, that no lawyer is going to back you up if you're going to sue a company that's got 5 or 10 trucks. Right? And then when you go against the ones that are much bigger than that, your obstacles are significant. Drag it out for years and the average driver's not. So they simply move on. Okay, from that, now that I brought everybody down, I'll pass it off. I don't know who's going to go next. I look forward to the questions.
We can hear now from our former chairperson of the Truck Leasing Task Force, Steve Rush.
Just let me get my timer on so I don't run over on my time.
Don't worry, I took from Todd's time.
I'd just like to start off by saying thank you very much to Michael Christopher for inviting me here. This will now I can lay claim to being involved in the trucking industry for 61 years, which is probably more than most of you have been on the earth. I've seen a lot in 61 years. If I get lost in this conversation, it's because I have to try to press 61 years into 15 minutes. I started back in 65 when I came home from the airport. Didn't know anything about trucking. I was a high school dropout that wanted to go on my own business. So you've got a big uphill climb to begin. I started out in a union shop as a cross-dock laborer. Trucking in that period of time, whether you're a truck driver or like I was a cross-dock laborer, was one of the highest paid blue collar jobs in the country. Very well treated, very well treated. The driver and, not so much in the cross dock, the driver, if he started at 8 o'clock in the morning and finished 4:30, whatever it was in the afternoon, he got paid for those 8 hours. If he worked any overtime, he got time and a half. If he worked through his lunch, he got time and a half. If sometimes they would bring you in early for a day's work, you got paid time and a half for that early start. You got paid for everything you did. There was no turnover. Drivers drove in day cabs, not sleeper cabs. Reception was a sleeper cab, and generally speaking, that was a two-man or a team operation. If you drove in a regional area and you went out, say, 300 or 400 miles on your trip, you would stay either in a motel or you stayed in a bunkhouse at that particular time. It was a great job. And in fact, I recall when you would shape that job, anytime you might run into 4 or 5 police officers there, shaping that job too to pick up some extra pay, because they were lower paid than the truck drivers. It was just a great profession. And you were thought of as knights of the road. People respected you. The people you worked for respected you. In that time period, excuse me, I happened to run into somebody that had a different truck than the rest of us. And it turned out he was in a lease purchase. That was the first time I heard that expression. It was probably around 1966. So I had a conversation with him. So I said to him, well, you know, how long you have to do that? He said, I remember right, it's 4 years. So you get 2 years down the road, take that truck, go somewhere. You have any equity? No. You have to stay here? Yes. What if you don't like the job? Well, then I just give it up. So you spend 2, 3 years down the road and just give it up. What if they don't like you? You get rid of it. I mean, they have total and absolute control. And when you think about it, it's like servitude, which leads to slavery, right? It's no different. It's bad. It's evil. It needs to be banned. And I know I've been involved with National Tank Truck for a long time. And if this audience was National Tank Truck, they'd be taking deep breaths now. Someone walk out the back door, you know, yeah, this guy's nuts. No, I'm not. I lived it. I lived it for 61 years. I've watched this stuff. So I realized then I don't want lease purchase. I want nothing to do with it. And not too long after that, I run into a true owner operator. And I learned, just like Steve had described, the difference between lease purchase and owner operator. And I got to remember back in that era, to pull loads for anybody else, if you were all customers, I couldn't deal with you if I didn't have my operating authority. You could only deal that through somebody that had the rights to haul your freight. So owner operators would get locked into a company, but if you don't like that company, just takes the truck and goes somewhere else. So you got to move it. And back then the rates were much higher. So you could make money as an owner operator, especially if you got the right company. So when I realized that that's something I could pursue, then I thought, you know what, this is the business I want to get in. Because I love driving a truck. I still do. And I know Todd's going to say he loved driving a truck too. I don't know any truck drivers that didn't love driving a truck. It gets in your blood. And it's still in my blood. At 82, almost 83 years old, I would get out and go drive the damn thing now if I had my license. But so I find that career path that I want. And I buy my first truck. 2 years in, I lose the motor. And it's got to be an out-of-frame overhaul, which means I'm going to be out for 3 weeks. I go to the company that I'm working for, and I say, hey, can I drive one of your company trucks so I can keep some money coming in? They go, oh, we got a better thing for you. We got this old Mac out in the back. We'll sell it. We'll make a good deal. So I'm like, all right, I'm looking at the truck. And then I look at the contract. I said, that's what it was, lease purchase. But then I remember, and I can't remember it all, it was about a 2-year deal, and it was a couple of bucks a month. It wasn't as bad as a brand new truck. So I thought, you know what? I had a 5-year plan. Every 5 years, I would save enough money and buy another truck. And that's how it rose to sleep. I said, maybe I can circumvent some of that time. I'll do this. So I start doing that while they're preparing my other truck. And finally, I don't know, it was a long time ago, 3, 4 weeks later, I get my first statement. No check. I open the statement. Oh my God. I owe these bastards money. And I didn't get anything. I got nothing. And they're buying stuff from me that I don't want, that I don't need. And they got no answer. So I said to them, well, you know what? You got some loads in there you didn't pay for me. You didn't pay me yet. So you keep that money, because apparently you need it more than I do, and keep your truck. So now I'm on the watch. I'm gonna find another job. But at that time in my career, my license wasn't very good. I didn't get caught speeding and things like that. So I had to be careful where I went. So I do another run, and there was a small carrier ran mostly from New Jersey into New England and back. So they had a terminal up in the Boston area, and I was able to get a backhaul out of one of those terminals. That was the next thing. So the loads were supposed to pay $65 or 65%. I get this backhaul, they cut that to 50%. So I what's this? Well, no, you already got load up, so now this. So you're whacking me for 15% because I made you some money, so you want a little bit more. So now I got to go. So I finally get my license cleared up, and as it turned out, a terminal down the road from us, excuse me, that company, had 90-some drivers there that went on strike. And this is now getting into the early 70s. Things are starting to change. Deregulation is becoming more and more of a common conversation, and they're finding ways to get around the union. The unions are good, but the unions got a little cocky and they started taking too much. So these people shut that terminal down, open it back up under another name, and open it up to owner-operators. Owner-operators at that time were not as prevalent as they are today, but they were treated much better back then. So I found my way over there and I went to work there. Totally different from the company. These guys were great people. They were all World War II veterans. They were just wonderful men. And I stayed there for 12 years. Deregulation comes in the early 80s. I leave and form my own company in 1983. I get emotional because the when I leave, I have 15 trucks. I built up a nice little team. I went out, found some new business, and I left. And I remember going through that period of time. I don't hear the word lease purchase again. I don't hear anything about it during those 12 years with that company because they didn't use it. They didn't want it. They wanted to treat their people right, so their people would take care of it. And that was a great lesson. In the meantime, I'm watching the rest of the trucking world, especially truckload. In the late 70s, Schneider, along with some other ATA carriers, lobbied the government to allow foreign drivers. Sound familiar? In 1977. And I'm sitting there and going, why? There's an overabundance of truck drivers. There's an overabundance. They're coming out of your ears. Why do these guys think they'll find somebody else? But they wanted lower cost labor. They couldn't figure out how to do it. They didn't want to treat people right. They didn't want to pay those benefits. So they do this. And in the 70s, late 70s, it wasn't competitive yet. We still had that operating. But they did it nevertheless. So now we go along and we go into the twos. And as I'm watching the other side, because I was in tank truck was not as crazy competitive as truckload. LTL wasn't bad. Unions still pretty much controlled LTL, still do to this day. But there's less competition, it's harder to get into. Truckload, on the other hand, that's a wild. Any truckload carriers in here? Any carriers? No, that's why I didn't hear me lose or have anything thrown at me. But so I go along and I'm watching the rest of the world, and I see what's going on in truck. And what Steve described to you, he probably missed it. It's bad. It's bad. And I've had conversations with my brothers in tank truck. They're not really on my side of this. I know some guys that do have some lease purchase rate, and they keep telling me, no, we treat them right, we treat them right. So maybe do, maybe don't. Not everybody wants to be in business. Not everybody wants to be in business. So why do they do this? Because they're new to the business. They're naive as hell. They've got a family back home. They got to pay bills, and you got them. So now you talk them into this. And it's crazy what they do. They have those guys that do this day in, day out, year in, year out. They have to have ice in their veins. What they've done to these people. It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. And it's affecting safety. It's affecting our fellow Americans. Now I'm watching because it's getting closer to where they can't find it. Just coming here yesterday, I was telling Steve, I think I mentioned it to Mike. I get off the plane and I'm going out and get you. First, I was going to get a taxi cab. assistance anymore. So now I'm trying to figure out my thing on my Uber, and I can't. So I call my daughter, my customer. She goes, Dad, they have an old timers app in here. I'll take care of it. So, well, while I'm waiting to get the Uber, I see another Uber driver. He's helping me trying to figure this thing out. And it turns out he was a truck driver for 40 years. And he said, I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't make any money. So now I'm an Uber driver. And I think of myself, my brother does. And not making money there. But it's a little bit less of a dead end because you don't have the big expense. You don't have that 80,000 pound, 70-foot long rig behind you. So it's got to be a little bit easier. So he tells me this thing. And he gives me his card, so I call him when I go home. Right? So now I get my Uber back. I get in the car with him. And he happens to be a man of color. And he's from Somalia. So me and my big mouth, like, oh, interesting times for you guys now. So he's been here for 8 years. And he was a truck driver. And he worked for Werner. He said, what a night. What a night. He said, they put me as a team, and I'm a novice driver. Now, as a former driver for about 19 years, the worst place you want to put a new driver is a team, because you can't sleep. And then you put a guy in there, doesn't know what the hell he's doing. He's back there, he can't sleep. Now he gets up, and he starts to worry about the guy that's now in the room, because he hasn't been sleeping. And they're both getting tired. I can tell you, many years ago, I did 3 East Coast, West Coast turn, back to back. It was a really good friend of mine. He was a great guy. And by the time we got finished in that third trip, we couldn't sit behind that wheel more than an hour. And even then, you couldn't trust it. This was unsafe. So these people right now that are pushing lease purchase, they can't figure out how to run their business and compete against their competitor unless they do exactly what they're doing. It's out of control. And I'm not for regulation back again, because that stifles entrepreneurship. They're not looking for entrepreneurials here. They're looking for fish that they can live on. So no matter what they tell you, that's crap. This is a bad, bad deal, and something has to be done. So that's my time. Almost finished. So, I just let me leave you with this. You can't feed a nation. You can't win a war. You can't run a trucking company without that truck driver. Something we've got to fix this. We've got to fix this. Take care of the truck driver and give him the credit that he's due. And this one is going to get you. Truck driver is a profession, and he's driving with the amateurs. And I'm sorry, don't become offended by this. You're the amateurs. It's if for no other reason through attrition, he becomes that much better. He sees things out in front that you have no clue what's happening. He reads the back of people's heads that are in front of him. He anticipates people coming on the on-ramp. He sees what's behind him, what's on the sides of him, and what's in front of him, all at once. You have no clue about that because you're a car driver. You don't have the time behind the wheel that driver has. You got to appreciate that. The industry does nothing to promote that. As a country, we don't do anything to promote that. And we need to fix that because that will help you become better drivers. The next time you see a truck, I want you to really think about it. You are the amateur next to the professional. Don't lose sight of that. And help us get these guys back on the plateau that they belong. They're nice to the road. They're not so much in recent times. And the reason is because of the situations that Steve and I both described, and I'm sure Todd is going to talk more about. We've let so many people behind the wheel that shouldn't be behind the wheel. They really shouldn't be. So we've got to get control of that. We've got to make sure that we fix things, keep moving forward. So I haven't run all over the place, but I've been practicing for a couple of days to see where I got to. All your time.
Hey, I'll clap for that. I can identify with quite a bit of it. I have to tell you that I'm really impressed with the presentation, the comprehensiveness of the presentation that Steve Vaselli put together. was he really did cover basically all of the bases. And my good friend to my left here, I listened, I was not a part of the task force, but I listened to all the task force hearings. And I found inspiration and motivation listening to Steve. Not only his experiences, basically the quality of his character, but his advocacy on behalf of the driver community. And of course, OIDA has been an advocate for drivers since our beginnings way back in 1973, started by a bunch of angry truck drivers, angry over the cards that we were dealt through the Arab oil embargo and a host of other things that basically were sort of, they perceived to be just keeping the little man down, and trucking was regulated then. I started in that environment, became a part of the organization, and pretty shortly after, the more I learned about trucking, and believe me, I knew nothing about trucking when I got in, nothing, and that's going to be pretty much common for most people still today. You think, why would anybody get involved in one of these lease purchase flow programs? Well, they don't know anything. And there's nobody that they trust, that they believe, that basically there to kind of provide them in a better direction. So they're easy, they're gullible. And, we have a lot of predators in our society. Now, trucking, I'm going to say, we've always had them, I suppose, in trucking, always have. But it didn't used to be, there's always been lease purchase programs, but things used to be different. Prior to deregulation in the 70s, and on and probably a little bit into the early 80s, you had two kinds of people in trucking. One, you had truckers that actually ran trucking companies. And the other people that basically that grew in numbers and influence after deregulation became the MBAs, the attorneys, and the accountants. They were not trucking people. They were not trucking people in any way, shape, or form. Placing value or integrity or care on the people behind the wheel, not their thing. And, we've seen that play out over and over and over. We talk about why people would be attracted to a lease purchase plan. Well, one, they don't know better, but these are people, they use the word entrepreneurship. And it is appropriate because people perceive themselves as entrepreneurs, and that, I look at this job, and if I'm willing to work hard, to bust my butt, to work smart, it's reasonable to assume that I would be able to get ahead, improve myself. There are people, we get calls in our office, have about these kinds of programs, and I said, there are people that get into these programs thinking, I'm going to do my truck, I'm going to do some more, I'm going to build me a fleet this way. Of course, it doesn't happen. But they believe that going in, and everybody they come into contact with is largely going to encourage them. Yeah, you can do it. There's nobody going to tell you otherwise. And it's because it's in their economic interest to use you in the capacity that you're in. Carriers figured out if you treat drivers crappy enough, they'll leave. You guys, everybody here's all, you've been hearing about this driver shortage crap since the 1980s. Well, there's never been a driver shortage. There's a hell of a retention problem. Drivers leave if they don't see opportunity to do better. You treat them like crap, or the environment that they work in becomes even more unconscionable than it is right now. They'll find something else to do. Good people will. The attractiveness of lease purchase is that these are carriers that have figured out, if we can convince this guy, or I say guys, there's also gals too, we convince this driver that you can do something with a lease purchase. We'll keep them, we don't have to treat them any better, but we'll keep them longer. We'll keep them on the hook. And they do. Steve's numbers on how many successful lease purchase programs there are. I mean, there aren't many. When we survey our members, we hear that about 1 in 10 may succeed, and 1 in 10, based on the other information that's been provided, that's pretty darn good. And it's still reprehensible, but it's still a lot better than the other. But bear in mind, there are going to be smaller carriers. They've got a driver that's a good driver. Driver wants to buy a truck, would like to own a truck. They make a determination whether or not they think they'll back this guy. And sometimes that's how folks get trucks. That's going to be one of the success stories. There aren't very many of them. Because, trucking is a tough business. We're seeing the face of trucking change quite a bit right now with the influence of more and more immigrants driving trucks. And, we watched that on the boards 30 years ago, longer than that. Ports were basically taken over by immigrant drivers, and generally, these are places where those folks can find work. Generally, these are not the most attractive jobs. I still remember the last conversation I had with Traffic World magazine, which basically I think closed its doors probably 25 years ago. They were asking how many members that we had working the ports in LA and Long Beach. And my response is, well, none. When the last one that could speak English was no longer there, we had no more members. Were immigrants attractive? Mainly because immigrants, and this is the big carrier mentality, and it used to be something that members of the TCA actually would occasionally inadvertently admit. They liked immigrant drivers because they never asked to go home. Never. And that's the ideal driver that too many companies are looking for today. There are certainly the most pleasurable aspect of driving a truck is just driving down the road, weather good, traffic not bad. That's what's good about the job. There are a lot of other things that are really, 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 really terrible. The fact that we've been pushing, our organization has been pushing for 25 years or longer to make truck parking a higher priority. Make some folks actually put some of these initiatives in the works. Let's build some parking. Let's create some parking. It seems like, given the importance of trucking, the numbers of truck drivers that there are, would seem like we'd be more successful in getting Congress to recognize the extent of the problem that this really is. And it is a major problem that affects highway safety and all kinds of things. It doesn't get more traction simply because the only people that's an important enough issue is for them to say make it a priority are those people behind the wheel, not the folks that make their money off of them. None of them, it ain't a priority to them because it's not their behind that's out there looking for some place to stop and rest. Again, it's important to carriers to get people locked into positions where they can work them. And the thing about leasing a truck, especially a lease purchase truck, is the carrier has absolute, total, complete control. The driver has no control over anything because it's the economics dictate everything. How they've been able to get away with it for so long, It's, it's kind of a frustrating thing. I don't want to blame or paint every carrier with the same broad brush that they're all bad, because I do know one carrier that I think, Dark Transit out of Minnesota, Eagan, Minnesota. I think that there's a lease purchase program out there, and a driver wanted to do that. That's where I tell them to go. Other than that, I would have no other recommendations. So I know if we truly want to place value on drivers, and as Steve said, good drivers are amazing drivers. When I drove for a living, I was proud of doing it safely. And if you're an owner operator, you have every incentive to do it safely, because it doesn't matter if an incident or a crash is not your fault. If it messes you up, if it messes up your schedule, if it tears up your equipment, it's a threat to your lifestyle. It's a threat to your household. You do everything to overcome the mistakes of other people. Those are the kinds of people that we want to have behind the wheel. But we only have them behind the wheel if we treat them right. We treat them fairly. And if we have an environment that allows them to develop, there aren't many of them that come out of the lease purchase programs. Truck drivers will kind of develop a sixth sense about other vehicles. And when I was driving a truck, I was a far better truck driver than I am a car driver. Because you always have to be keen to your total surroundings, where I could fit, where that truck would go. I knew better where I could put my truck from the driver's seat than I did getting out and looking around. I mean, I knew where it would go. And it's just from doing it, being comfortable with it. And drivers do the sixth sense I'm talking about, what a vehicle looks like, what color it is, how they're driving, who you can see behind the wheel. This is going to be somebody that's going to cause me a problem, and I'm going to keep my distance. So, and good drivers do that. And I don't know if autonomous I don't think there's any autonomous to compare, but hey, there are some that want us to see. I guess really, that's really all I really need to contribute here. Like I said, I'm thankful for my colleagues on this panel for actually doing the real nuts and bolts. But whatever we can do to make these things better, where we can actually develop good people and not just squander them, we need to try to do.
I thank you for those comments there. And this is definitely an interesting topic as it relates to the overall safety of these commercial motor vehicle operators, that if you have a driver that's under all this tremendous pressure and all these other things going on in the background, it is definitely going to have an adverse impact on their safe operations. I guess these three distinct talk. I do have a follow-up question for Todd. Wyden has endorsed a bill introduced in the House this past September that aims to prohibit predatory lease purchase programs offered or managed by motor carriers. From your perspective, do you see this legislation moving forward without significant controversy?
I'd sure love to say yes, but I know better than that. There are carriers that make a very, very, very lucrative living by running these programs. And realistically, if you're the one that's writing the contract, to whose benefit are you going to write the contract? I didn't mention it a while ago, but there's none of these lease purchase guys ever get to review these contracts. You say that you reviewed it, but you didn't help. We talk to guys that don't even have a copy of the contract. They're signed electronically. Yeah, there's going to be significant pushback. There's going to be significant pushback. It doesn't matter what business you're in, whether it's good business or bad business, if you're making money from it, you don't want to mess it up. So they'll fight like crazy.
And I guess a follow-up question for the two Steves. Some argue that current leasing practices exploit inexperienced drivers. Others say they provide entrepreneurial opportunity. Based on your experience on the truck leasing task force, where do you believe the line should be drawn?
I'll take that first. Like I said, we came with a range of opinions. I think Steve wanted to find some models that we could recommend. We had a member who had done a lease purchase herself, who came in thinking that there was a way that we could make some solid recommendations that would work in the real world. And in the end, we all did come to the consensus that our first recommendation was that carriers just should not be leasing trucks to their workers. The alternative is, I think, a number of regulations, recommendations, data efforts to try to improve these. And I think that is going to be a complex challenge. There are some steps we can take immediately, like we need to get better data. When we have an accident, we need to know, what is the employment relationship with that driver? Who are they in a lease purchase? Are they leasing? What are they paying for that truck? What's their compensation? The basic things that common sense is going to tell us. Once we have that data, it's going to point to some relationships about what decisions drivers are making to improve safety. So we called for an out. We thought that a ban was the only realistic solution to really end this problem. But then we have a number of detailed recommendations. Yeah.
If you follow, at least when I follow my history of the business, you've watched it come out. It was minuscule back in the 60s and 70s. And now in the 20s, it started to pick up speed. And it's picking up speed, I believe, on the race to the bottom. If they keep doing this, they're not going to have drivers. Look at just from coming over from the airport. Two people I run into them, two of them have turned in those up the truck. And lease purchase has everything to do with that. So, and to back up on the first question, oh yeah, you're going to see pushback like crazy. Those truckload people are going to. If they were sitting in this room right now and telling me they put an assassination on my head. So.
Another follow-up question for the two Steves. Are there disagreements within the industry about what constitutes predatory leasing versus high risk but legitimate business models? Are there disagreements within the industry about what constitutes predatory leasing versus high risk but still legitimate business models? It's questionable, but it is a legitimate one, and maybe the driver could come out of it okay.
We had a this hypothetical, and Todd suggested that you could have a small carrier out there with a good driver that's helping them do it. But ultimately, I feel like those, when we did hear about that, we didn't see any evidence of it or have anybody come forward and say that they were part of it. But we have this idea that it's somewhere out there, it must exist. I think those are the informal. You trust your employer, and you got a good personal relationship. Outside of that, we didn't see any examples of those better programs. And so the concern I would have with a bill like that, where we have, where we're prohibiting predatory leasing, is then we're going to get in the debate about what predatory is. And so we're going to, just similar to what we have in misclassification now, if we're going to end up with a 20-point test or something like that. Now we can provide some better model language, things like that, but ultimately I think the clear bright line has to be, if you're a motor carrier, you can't lease the vehicle to your employee. There are means out there for drivers to get into trucks and finance trucks independently, et cetera. And if it makes financial sense, that's what they do.
I think you too, ask yourself a question, because I asked this several times. If that person wants to lease me that truck, he knows I'm going to get into the trucking business. Isn't he worried about me becoming a competitor to his and taking his business? That always, especially this person. is true. So what do they do? Well, they can't figure it out themselves. And that's a problem. You got these big guys with their MBAs, and they can't figure out how to run these trucking companies without climbing on the back of that driver. That's pretty scary. That's pretty scary. Because it can be done. It can be done. I had less than 5% turnover. I put my drivers in a motel. And I made money. So if I could do that with 79 trucks, you sure as hell I'll be able to do it with 790 or 1,000 trucks. So they need to start looking in the mirror and get off the backs of these drivers.
I think we've managed our time very well, so I think we've got time for some questions from the audience. If anyone's got a question, see a question from Zach over there.
Yeah, I'll just be loud, just real quick, based on the data and interviews. I'm really curious what you found from the carrier perspective in terms of financial benefit. Like, how much more are they making from this agreement? How much of their business model were they really reaping from the current purchase agreement? And I think calling out how much they're winning, if you want to call it that, is powerful for folks. On the back of the
Yeah, I mean, we saw in the data that was available that we could find, I gave the one example where you had drivers who were above average productivity for this carrier who were earning, a third of what the average driver in the industry was. So, it's pretty profitable to have someone driving a truck all week for you and not paying them. Like that's a tremendous, advantage to a carrier. And we see fleets that, they just can't get enough of them because, these drivers are, if there's any, inefficiency in there, there are loads that don't, come on time, you're delayed, you get a breakdown. Instead of paying that driver for that time and paying for that truck, it comes out of the driver's paycheck before they get anything coming home. So it's enormously profitable.
I might just contribute to that in that it's probably a mistake to assume that every entity or carrier that provides these kind of programs is actually in the business to move freight for real monetary gain. So this goes all the way back to when there was an Interstate Commerce Commission and freight rates and things like that were regulated. The ICC looked at least one carrier, and I'm sure they looked at far more that had a lease purchase program that determined that carrier made more money off of the lease purchase program than they did with hauling freight. And today, all these years later, there are big carriers. I can think of one big carrier that may be exclusively lease purchase, and they clearly make far more income, far more profit from their truck leasing business than they do from the cargo that they're moving. So yeah, there is a tremendous economic incentive for those folks that in this line of business to continue to operate the way that they do.
I think to add to that, Zach, is why are more and more carriers doing it? Because they can't compete. They have to compete the same way. So, and one of the things I like to share this with everyone too, a number of years ago, I'm from Maine originally, and I meet this guy from Bangor, Maine. He had 200 or 300 trucks. He sold them at the same time I did. So I'm having a conversation with him, and I said, Barry, do you use that lease purchase? He looks at me and said, yeah. He said, really? You started like I did with one truck, and you can do that to people? He looks at me and he goes, well, who am I going to sell my trucks to? I mean, that's sick. Who am I going to sell my trucks to? To this dumb cluck that came in here and bought this nonsense that you're going to get rich with the lease purchase. Who am I going to sell my trucks to? And they all think. It's crazy. There's one very, very large carrier from Wisconsin that advertises, come buy my truck. Come buy my truck and I'm going to give you a job. And I'm sure we've all seen the signs of some of these trucks that say, make $4,500 a week. And that's a pretty cool job. Make $4,500 a week. oh, by the way, you gotta pay all this, this, and this before you pay yourself. They don't know that. They come in with that naiveness, and they don't know that they gotta pay everything else. You're in business now. You get paid less. Maybe you don't get paid at all. In this case, no.
And just to follow up on that, what Steve's describing, we saw quite a bit of that where firms would have their employees driving the newer trucks and, that were reliable. And after they had a certain number of miles on them, then they didn't want to pay for the maintenance.
Oh, yeah, I was sharing this with Steve last night. One of my drivers, former drivers, lives in Canada. So I was talking the other day, because he hates these bridges. So they all, I don't know any driver that have been through that. I'll say the same story. So this guy's from Canada. And he said, wait till you hear this one. He said, they bring the lease and purchase guy in, and they pay $250,000 for the tractor. And he's on a 7 to 8 year lease. 7 to 8 year lease. They get 4 years into the lease. They bring him a new contract and said, hey, we're trading that truck in. Now you got a new lease. I think that's criminal. It's criminal. Got to do something.
Another question here?
So what's your idea on doing anything about it?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that, because I was hoping somebody would ask that question. I just shared it last night too. I was thinking about it. I think about it all the time. How do we fix it? Nobody wants to go back to regulated rate. It's like, just a few got rich. So
Right.
this just came into my mind within the last. How do you fix it? I suggest that we pay all truck drivers, mandate all truck drivers pay by the hour. From the time you start to the time you finish. You got electronic logs now, use them. So when the driver punches in, he's on the clock. When he punches out, he's off the clock. So I thought about that, and I said, okay, that works, but the government missed it when they put the electronic logs in, and they only put it in the over-the-road trucks. As a former cheater, a long-time driver, I can tell you that the worst cheaters of all are the local guys. They didn't put the log in there. I don't know why. But so it needs to go in that. All trucks have to have the electronic log to monitor. They all get paid by the hour. So I ran this by a couple of guys that've been in business a long time. And then it's, well, where's the hourly wage? Well, it can't be minimum wage. So you've got to set a bottom. So just throwing a number out there. Let's say the bottom is $25. So I hire you at $25 an hour, but Todd says, no, I want you. I'll give you 30. And then goes from there. And then the truckers now all in that same shoe. So they've got to fix their structure to match that. So I think that'll work. And then when I switched my drivers to paying by time, oh my God, it changed them forever. Changed them forever. They like that. But they get in their truck today, and they know at the end of the day, I'm getting X. And if I get in the truck tomorrow, they're getting X again. So the way they get in the truck today, they'll get until they get the paycheck. And half of them can't figure it out anyway. So now I'm glad you asked that question.
So you're a big proponent of the GUT Act, right? The all hours worked, all hours paid.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely.
Which is the GUT Act. I can't remember the bill number, but
Yeah, the drivers should be paid for everything he does.
yes.
I know, I was just talking to two gentlemen in the back there about the hours of service. They were for getting it changed. When I first looked at the hours of service, I put it on my desk because I'm not supposed to be, I just tell the story. I was a world class cheater. You couldn't catch me. But I logged out exactly how I did it. And then used to say, I changed the date to protect the innocent. They couldn't catch me. There was a time I turned California backloaded both ways with hazmat in 6.5 days. That's how I used to run when I was a young man. And then I was alone. There were other people doing that. So the two gentlemen back there said, no, I know my body. Well, when I went to a truckload associated meeting a number of years ago, they had a meeting in there, group on sleep patterns, and it was powerful. When I rolled my first truck at 23 years old, I was working 18 hours a day, Monday through Friday, 12 on Saturday, and 3 on Sunday. Local, running US Mail. 18 hours a day, 5 days a week. I rolled that truck over 23. And for all those years, this was probably 12 years ago that I saw this session. And up until that day, I thought that I rolled that truck because I had learned how to sleep or stay awake. And it wasn't until I was in that session, oh my God, my body was abusing me. And I didn't fall asleep because I didn't know how to stay awake. I fell asleep because I wasn't treating my body the way it's supposed to be treated. Sleep habits are incredibly important. And after I came back from that session, I met with my dispatchers and my manager, and I said, hey, new rule. Nobody is allowed to go beyond 2 hours of their sleep pattern. If it goes 1 hour past, we need to have a discussion and prove this amongst us. That important. And the drivers, once that happened, those drivers changed dramatically. They bought into it. And some of these were old timers that have been doing it a long time. And they said, you proved it to me. I need my sleep patterns. And they started sticking right to them. You couldn't push them out of that after they learned it because they weren't. So when whoever did that study and changed those hours, God, I'd love to meet them. I hug them 100 times because they got it right. It's for the driver.
Mhm.
And the ones that want to change it now are those same people that have lease purchase, but they can't get enough work out of it. That's why they want to change it. They want to get you working those 18 hours a day.
Right.
And by the way, I got paid a salary. But I was broke. I had no choice.
Well, with that, I think we've run out of our time here today, and I'd like to thank my panelists, Steve Rush, Spencer, and Steve Shelley, and thank all of you for attending and questions from the audience, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and enjoy the golden ice cream in the next concurrent session, and the break will be from 2:30 to 3 p.m. in the foyer, and take time to register for the blood drive being held tomorrow. So thank you all very much for attending.